Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is a familiar face, Arline Sachs, who was the host of the show for many years. So welcome back, Arline. And today we're going to talk about, in an earlier show, we talked about translating documents from foreign languages, mainly German and Hebrew. And, sometimes as we talked about, words translate to something, but it doesn't always necessarily make sense in what the translation is. So we have to be sure that we are translating them correctly. And then what we're going to talk about today is errors in documents, things that are in documents that we suspect or we know when we look at them are incorrect. So, what did you translate, and where were you, or were you sure that the translation was accurate as you worked on the documents?
My great-great-grandfather wrote a diary, I call them diaries or journals, from 1817 to 1877. So I've got a lot of information. And one day...
And I envy you.
Yeah, but they were written in Hebrew script letters and the language was German. It only took me 10 years to figure out what it was, and then I had to learn how to read it.
But you have them.
Yeah, I have them now. And they had been given away, so the whole story on how I got them back. But one day he wrote, my son couldn't come home, the bridge drove off. Well, the person that was editing my book, which is this one here, you've translated it wrong. Well, I didn't translate it wrong. Here's a picture of the bridge, hopefully. There, oh no, that's the second picture. Anyway, it was a pontoon bridge, and if he goes back a slide, we'll see it. And there's the original bridge. And you can't quite tell from that. I thought there was little boats underneath it. But then when that's the city of Mainz over there, and it's taken from Kastel where he lived. And this is out of a history book from Kastel. Kastel was originally a Roman fortress.
So this was a bridge where we didn't have the capability of building it high enough, so they had to move it.
High enough, or perhaps just a much cheaper way of putting these wooden boards, and then you walked across it. And somebody said, this is actually from the US. I got this picture at the Library of Congress, but it shows how the bridge could drive off. I mean, they didn't use drive in the sense that we use drive. But it moved off. Yeah. If there was ice, or if something else came. I didn't even think of other traffic, but he was writing in the context of ice or heavy waters, after a storm, it might be dangerous to walk.
Well, of course, like today we have drawbridges or, where the bridge goes up, so ships can go through, that could have been something that...
Yeah, but that wouldn't have stopped him totally from coming home, but ice where they had to actually drive off the bridge. And so that's what happened. But until I found that picture, I have no idea what bridge drive off.
Well, one of the other things, and I know we've talked about this before, it said he entered through the fish gate.
Yes, and that's another thing. What's a fish gate? Well, over the years, they've got this wrong thing up there right now. But one of the things I talked to the professor in the University of Mainz, and I happened to mention, he wrote the funniest thing that he entered through a fish gate. She said, oh, it was right over there. We just passed it. That's the cornerstone. That's where they brought the fish into town. We don't think of walled cities. And that's exactly what the city of Mainz was in those days. It was a walled city. And it immediately made sense in that at another time he'd mentioned a wood gate. That's obviously where the wood was brought into the city. We just don't think of that.
And, well, we saw the example of the wax or the half.
Okay, well, I'll go on to that one. In Orthodox synagogues, and I've mentioned this on a previous show, but it really fits here too. In an Orthodox synagogue today, men and women often don't sit together, either in the back or up above. And these people seem to have taken this a step further, and the rabbi decreed that any woman that entered through the man's gate the husbands would be fined a half a wax. Of course, it couldn't be the woman. Women had no money. It had to be the husband that was fined if she came in the wrong gate. And it took my son, who did the translation, a while to figure out that the half of a wax refers to the wax that it takes to light the synagogue for a set amount of time. We don't know whether that was a day or whether it was just during a service, but that sort of explains what it was. But in today's date, who thinks of in those terms?
Well, and of course you have to know about customs and things, and they do change over time. And when I was reading through the materials and trying to remember, I know the Quaker religion, they had separate meetings for the women. I can't remember whether the meeting house had separate entrances or not. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I do remember something about there being actual separate entrances for the women to come in. And the men to come
I think this is so important in anybody doing genealogy. As a beginner just tends to look up the names, and you've got to remember the times. You have to understand the history, because it doesn't make sense to us 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. Kids today don't know what a portable typewriter is. We went to school, you couldn't go to college without one.
Well, and that's the thing. Periodically, one of the websites that I'm on comes up with quizzes of terminology of
shows how old
what
you are.
did these things, yes, exactly, what did these things mean, slang terms and things like that. And so, we have those kinds of things that what about I can't come, I have to do the wash? That was another one of the
I just happened to be sitting with my mother. Again, it was one of the things. Bernard Kahn had copied a letter from his daughter. Bernard Kahn's house collapsed, and then the daughter wrote, "I can't come, I have to do the wash." And I happened to be sitting to my mother was visiting, and she said, well, it was totally perfectly clear to her. She said, well, of course, once a month a girl came in from the country, and they put a big cauldron out in the backyard and lit a fire and boiled the water and did the wash, and she came back the next day and did the ironing. And you couldn't call her. You didn't have a telephone. There would have been no way for you to directly contact her. And besides, she would have had other clients, other people that she did the wash for on other days. You couldn't change it. So it was perfectly clear. Now, my mother was born in 1906. This happened roughly in, let's say, 50 years before that. But it was still a common practice in the towns. And my parents were not, grandparents were not rich. My grandfather was a cobbler. So, he had made a good living, but he certainly wasn't among the rich. But anybody, so it was common for anybody to do something like that. But again, you have to understand the times.
Yes, and as we talked about in a previous show, also you have to know the whole definition of words, particularly when you're dealing with legal documents. You need to know and understand the entire meaning of it. I kept seeing people referred to as infants, and I think of an infant as somebody, a year to 2 years old max. And I knew these kids as I progressed in things, these kids are getting up 10, 12 into teen years. So when I looked the term up in a law dictionary, it's any child under the age of majority, which is 18 for females for the most part and 21 for men during that time. So, then we have to look at the various documents and, believe, are they accurate? And this can be a fun challenge.
Do you believe in what you find in an encyclopedia?
An encyclopedia, I would say for the most part, I probably would. But when they had something called cyclopedias, which were a form of kind of the slang term is brag books, where people put information in. They went around and usually it was the more prominent people, the wealthier people, that would put their family history in. Found lots of mistakes in those. But in encyclopedia,
I'm not sure that I believe everything.
You have to play
let's
with
take
that.
a look at a 1908 Jewish encyclopedia. This is Hirsch Frankel, who I've talked about in another show. And it says there he died in 1723. He did not die in 1723. The source for that is a man called Hanley, who wrote in 1867, just before a newspaper article, a lengthy newspaper article came out about Hirsch Frankel. That started in 1768. And I am sure in my own mind that these two men corresponded or knew each other. Now let's take a look at Jewish Encyclopedia in 1908, way past copyrights and so on. This is from the online one. And I don't know if you can see it, but what I have circled is there, instead of saying Ansbach, A-N-S, I'm assuming it's a character recognition area, it says Ausbach, A-U-S. There is no such town. Now, somebody reading that in an encyclopedia is going to think it's right, and they're going to spend an awful lot of time looking for a town called A-U-S-B-E-R-G. On the other hand, there is one A-U-G-S, Augsburg. They might try to look at that thinking a letter had been left out. But this is an encyclopedia. You think that what you have there is right.
Well, we hope that is true. But, documents is another thing, where documents, not even necessarily from long ago 100% accurate.
Well, I'm going to show you one that I'm taking to be accurate, because he signs it at the bottom. And I have something, I realize you can't read it, but this is a 1793 birth certificate of Bernard Kahn, who I've mentioned. And what I have underlined there is his grandfather's name, because his grandfather is a witness. And what I have circled at the bottom is the grandfather's signature. Sure. So I'm assuming he's telling the truth about his age. And it says he is 72 years old. Go on to the next slide, which is the old man's death certificate. Again, I've underlined his name. I've underlined his age, and at the bottom is a translation, which obviously you can't read on the screen, but suddenly he's 92. It's exactly 10 years later. It's August 1803, and he's aged 20 years.
Well, and one of the things we have to remember, I have students that get so hung up on, well, it says that he is such and such, or she is such and such an age. And really, it was not as important to our ancestors that they keep track of their age. So it's understandable that they do just naturally lose track and misstate, or on purpose state they're younger or older than they are.
I think that in this case, well, maybe he did lie and was 82 when he signed it. But on the other hand, when you think of the time period, that he was just an old man the first time. So then they assumed, that's how they got to it. I don't know.
Yeah. One of the things that I have is my parents, my uncles' death certificates, and they all have that they are high school graduates on them, which is not correct. And when I asked the funeral director, finally, my mother died after my father, and after a brother of hers, who I also was handling the arrangements, and his says the same thing. I asked about it, and the answer was that people my parents and my uncle's age were sensitive about questions like that. So they don't ask you unless you've indicated you've gone to college or something. They put everybody down as a high school graduate. And as I've said, you know, if somebody doesn't find my research but finds their death certificates and things are as they are today, know where they should have gone to high school, the first thing I would do if I were the person would be go to the Historical Society that has all the yearbooks to look for pictures.
And you wouldn't find?
You wouldn't find any for my mother or my uncle. You would find my father's freshman and sophomore years. He's in there, but he quit after 10th grade. My mother and her brother quit after 8th grade, which was not uncommon in the 1930s and 40s.
Oh, well, even earlier than that, says a father was in high school in the First World War and too young to be drafted. So he went out and worked on a farm because they drafted the farmers. So he never went back to school. And my mother-in-law, she said the normal age to quit school was after 2 years.
Well, yeah, I look at and I forget whether it's the 1930 or 40 census where it asks the highest level of education. And it's surprising some of the ages at which people, second, third grade, fourth grade.
But you could earn a living. A farmer, you needed to know a little bit, you needed to add and subtract to buy stuff, but you didn't need all of the advanced stuff that you need in our society.
Yes. And of course, birth certificates is another one. We, I think, have an example of.
Yes, my own. I have 3 different birth certificates with 3 different things on it. So if we take a look at that, the first one is the one that you would really expect is the vital statistics one. That's the general place you would go, and you'd certainly believe it. Again, I don't know if you can read it off the screen, but I've got it, my name, E, A-R-L-E-N-E, which is, of course, the normal spelling for an E, for Arline. And my mother's name is Helda, the H-E-L-D-A. And when I first saw that, I said, well, she hadn't been in the country long. They probably misunderstood her. But we'll go on to the next one. And this is from the hospital. And again, my name is spelled with an E. This does not list my parents' name at all. And we go on to the third one. And the City of Chicago Health Department. That my name has an I in it. So if somebody, 100 years from now looks at this stuff, well, 2 of them have an E on it. She must have just been trying to be fancy. But I was always taught my name had an I, A-R-L-I-N-E.
Well, and one of the things I think we should point out, too, with vital records, if people are not familiar, it depends on what the state does. A lot of states, like New Jersey, where I grew up, and Virginia, take an actual photocopy of the vital record that they have, and then they certify it down the bottom, put it on the fancy paper. But some states still take a blank copy of the certificate, fill it out, and certify it, and that doesn't always get copied accurately. I know of one case where someone I saw, their aunt or their great aunt's birth certificates. They had 3 different copies that family members had done at various times, and every one of them had one fact that differed from the other 2, yet every one of them was certified that it was an accurate copy.
I think what genealogists have to do is ask for a photocopy. And that's, of course, much easier to do than it was 10 years ago or 20 or 30 years ago, because you can just, they're probably digitizing their records anyway.
And I mean, I'm surprised, but recently as last year and a half, I have still seen vital records that are being copied rather than photocopied and certified.
I had that in Germany. Of course, now they're really, really strict anyway, but I did have somebody that copied the information and sent me a copy of it, assuming that I couldn't read the German.
And of course, we also, or you also have another example of someone who is near and dear to the show and a mistake in her
Sally
name.
Ann Sack, who was my co-hostess for at least 10 years on the show, was very specific from the first time I met her. My name is one word. It's Sally Ann, no 2 words. And she sent me her birth certificate, and there it is, Sally Ann. And because I happen to be corresponding with her just recently. She says, "Oh, I had the same thing."
Well,
So
and I know a few kids or girls when I was growing up that were Mary Ann. Some of them it was all one word, and some of it was Mary and Ann.
Sally Ann is sort of more unusual.
Usual,
Mary
yes.
Ann, I've heard for both of them.
Yeah.
It could be, but Sally Ann, okay, that's the way she went, but that's what she was taught. I was always taught that way. Now, of course, we'll look at some that we expect more errors on, and that's census records. And we'll look at that first census record. And again, I don't know if you can read it, but we'll look first of all at the names. The name is Lazarus and Rachel, and that was their names. They'd been married 18 years. Their oldest daughter is 16, but born in Russia, and we always thought they came in 1882, although I think that 18 refers to the years married. But we do know that, so I don't know exactly how accurate that one is. We do know from family lore, even my husband's father, who was the youngest child there, said that one child had been born in Europe before they came and died. So that accounted for the 10 children, 9 living. Now we'll take a look 10 years later, and again, I'm not sure if you can read it. What the name Lazarus is now Louis. The name Rachel is now Ray. Now she did always spell her name R-A-E, so documents other than the census records say R-A-E, but on the census records, of course, it's just the person listening, and they wrote down R-A-Y. Rachel, she's now 45. I mean, she was 45 before, she's now 37. So she only aged, she was 37, I'm sorry, now she's 40. I don't know, anyway, it didn't come out right. But Sadie is 24 and she was 16. Okay, yeah, Rachel aged 8 years, Sadie aged 8 years. And the other interesting thing where I have a couple of red stars is now Sadie is all of a sudden born in Missouri instead of Russia. The other thing is that there are 9 children, 8 living. And the oldest son did die of an appendix attack in the early 1900s. That accounts for 1, but that kid that was born in Russia, he's gone.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things that I have found in censuses. I found one family where 3 censuses, so we're talking, 4 censuses, so we're talking 30 years. The husband aged a total of 26 years.
Yeah.
The wife aged 54 years.
Oh dear.
And when I looked at it, I thought, okay, is this a case of the wife has died and maybe the mother is coming in? Yeah. No. As I investigated, it was the same family. It was the wife. So you wonder who gave the answers. I don't think she did. I just can't imagine.
I wonder if they wrote that number wrong, the one that was so young that for the man, if it might have been a 5 and the top line disappeared.
No, it was a case of the census was very readable.
Okay.
It was a good, I thought of all those things, but nothing could dispute it. But, you do have that. And of course, I have found in people wanting to fit in, become more Americanized, that quite often they will drop where they were actually originally from in later censuses, like dropping Russia and saying that they were born in Missouri or another place.
As it happened, by Sadie having been born in this country, she would then be eligible for the Social Security when it came. Of course, they didn't think of that back in 1910, but that's actually what happened. And sometimes, and you see a great variety of people from Europe because the countries changed. It might have been Russia 1 year and Germany another year, Poland another year. Yeah, so that did change. Now we have the 1920 census on there too, and Ray is still written as R-A-Y, and now she's 55. Sadie aged 11 years this time, and she's still born in Missouri. And there's one more census which I thought was very interesting. There's nothing wrong with it, but if I were to look at it, I would be suspect. And on the top of that, which quickly disappeared, there it is. In white, I try to highlight what it says up there. It says if there's an X with a circle around it, that's who answered the question. And if you look at the bottom, the person with that little symbol around it, it's the third name down. And then you look over to their age, he was 9 years old. So it's a 9-year-old answering the questions.
Well, and sometimes things like that may account for why things are off.
Yeah.
You know, other times people say, well, maybe the neighbors gave the information or things like that.
But in this case, the child answered, and the ages are, even of the adults are correct. Maybe they put that symbol on the wrong place. Who knows? I have one more example, because we're running short on time. And this is a death certificate, and this is this same Ray Sachs. Her age is wrong. If the 1900 census was correct, she would be at least 67, not 63, the way it says there. They most likely asked her, how long have you been here? And she answered 30 years. This is in Chicago. She was in Chicago close to 30 years, but in the country 48. And there's 2 different questions on that. And the third thing on that death certificate, is, and that's important for people to look at, is where this information came from.
Who the informant was.
And in this case, it was the hospital records.
Okay.
And so she didn't even tell her doctor how old she was. She was not about to.
Yes.
So, you know, who knows how old she actually was, but I tend to think it was more than 63.
Yes. Well, we appreciate your coming back and visiting and sharing this. It's been very informative. We also do want to thank the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, who sponsors us, and let everybody know that they do have a research library. It is open to the public. It's open Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday from 10 to 4, so go down and visit them.